Picture this. It's your wedding day, the most important day of your life. And instead of celebrating your love, your bride's family is openly mocking you in front of 200 guests. They're calling you worthless, a nobody who doesn't deserve their daughter. What they don't know is that with one phone call, you could destroy their entire world. This is the story of Michael Thompson, a man who endured the ultimate humiliation only to reveal a power so devastating that it would cost nearly $1 billion and change everything forever. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you re-watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Michael Thompson was the kind of man who blended into crowds. At 32, he wore simple clothes, drove a modest Honda Civic, and worked what appeared to be an ordinary desk job at a consulting firm in downtown Chicago. His neighbors in the quiet suburb of Elmhurst knew him as the polite guy who always said good morning and kept his lawn perfectly trimmed. What they didn't know was that behind that unremarkable exterior lay one of the most influential decision-makers in the construction industry. When Michael met Sarah Williams at a coffee shop 2 years earlier, it was love at first sight. Sarah was everything he wasn't: vibrant, outgoing, and from a family that owned half the commercial real estate in the Chicago metropolitan area. The Williams family had built their fortune over 3 generations, starting with Sarah, his great-grandfather, who immigrated from Ireland with nothing but determination and a willingness to work 18-hour days. Sarah's father, Robert Williams, was a man who measured worth in dollar signs and social status. He owned Williams Development Corporation, a company that had constructed some of Chicago's most recognizable buildings. Robert's wife, Patricia, came from old money and never let anyone forget it. Together, they had created an empire worth over $200 million, and they expected their only daughter to marry someone who could contribute to that legacy. From the moment Sarah brought Michael home, the Williams family made their disapproval crystal clear. During their first dinner together, Robert barely acknowledged Michael's presence, speaking only to Sarah as if her boyfriend was invisible. Patricia made passive-aggressive comments about Michael's less quaint little apartment and his interesting career choice. Sarah's brother, James, who worked as vice president of the family business, openly questioned what his sister saw in someone so ordinary, but Sarah loved Michael for who he was, not what he owned. She saw his intelligence, his kindness, and his quiet confidence. What she didn't see, because Michael never told her, was that her seemingly modest boyfriend held a position that could make or break companies like her family's business with a single decision. Michael worked for Meridian Capital Group, one of the most powerful private equity firms in the country. His official title was Senior Investment Director, but that humble-sounding position gave him final approval authority over infrastructure projects worth billions of dollars. Meridian had partnerships with major banks, government agencies, and international investors. When Michael signed off on a project, money flowed. When he didn't, companies went bankrupt waiting for funding that would never come. He had spent 15 years climbing the corporate ladder, starting as a junior analyst straight out of Northwestern University. His colleagues respected him for his meticulous attention to detail and his ability to spot potential problems that others missed. Michael had prevented 3 major financial disasters in his career by refusing to approve projects that looked good on paper but were fundamentally flawed. He was known in the industry as the Guardian, the man who protected investors from bad decisions, but Michael chose to live modestly. He had grown up in a working-class family where his father was a mechanic and his mother was a school teacher. They had taught him that money didn't define a person's worth, and that the most important things in life couldn't be bought. So while his annual salary exceeded $500,000, Michael lived in a simple 2-bedroom apartment, drove a car he had owned for 6 years, and found happiness in small pleasures like reading books and cooking dinner for the woman he loved. The Williams family interpreted his modest lifestyle as evidence of his limited means. They never bothered to ask about his work beyond the surface level. When Michael said he worked in investment consulting, they assumed he was some low-level financial advisor helping middle-class families plan their retirements. The irony was devastating. The man they dismissed as financially insignificant controlled more money than their family had ever seen. As Michael and Sarah's relationship deepened, the family's hostility intensified. Patricia would make comments about how Sarah was settling and how she could do so much better. Robert refused to include Michael in family business discussions, even when Sarah specifically asked him to be inclusive. James took every opportunity to remind Michael that the Williams family had standards, and those standards didn't include men who drove economy cars and shopped at Target. The breaking point came when Michael proposed. He had saved for months to buy Sarah a beautiful but modest engagement ring, a 1-carat diamond in a classic setting that cost him $8,000. To Michael, it represented his love and commitment. To the Williams family, it was proof of his inadequacy. $8,000? Patricia had said, examining the ring with obvious disappointment. Sarah, darling, your father spent more than that on my tennis bracelet last Christmas. Robert was even more direct. Son, he said, though the word dripped with condescension, if you can't afford to give my daughter the life she's accustomed to, maybe you should reconsider this engagement. Sarah defended Michael fiercely, but the damage was done. The message was clear. He wasn't good enough for their family, and they were going to make sure everyone knew it. Despite the family's objections, Sarah and Michael moved forward with their wedding plans. They chose a beautiful venue, sent out invitations, and prepared for what should have been the happiest day of their lives. What Michael didn't know was that the Williams family had decided to use the wedding as an opportunity to publicly humiliate him into leaving their daughter alone. The wedding day arrived on a crisp Saturday in October. The ceremony was held at the prestigious Oak Brook Hills Resort, a venue that cost more than most people's annual salary. 200 guests filled the elegantly decorated ballroom, including Chicago's business elite, political figures, and social influencers. It was exactly the kind of event the Williams family loved, an opportunity to display their wealth and connections. Michael stood at the altar wearing a navy blue suit he had purchased off the rack at Men's Warehouse. It was a nice suit, well-fitted and appropriate, but in a room full of custom Italian tailoring, it might as well have been a potato sack. He could feel the judgmental stares and hear the whispered comments, but he focused on Sarah walking down the aisle in her stunning white dress, and nothing else mattered. The ceremony itself went smoothly, but the reception was where the Williams family's true intentions became clear. During the cocktail hour, Robert made a point of introducing his new son-in-law to various business associates, but not in a welcoming way. "This is Michael Thompson," Robert would say with a thin smile. "He's Sarah's husband. He works in... What was it again, Michael? Investment consulting?" The way he said it made it sound like Michael sold insurance door to door. Patricia was even more cutting. When the society photographer asked to take family portraits, she made sure to position Michael at the edge of every shot. "We want to make sure the important people are prominently featured," she explained loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. But the worst moment came during the dinner speeches. James Williams stood up to give what was supposed to be a toast to the happy couple, but instead delivered a thinly veiled attack on Michael's character and financial prospects. "My sister Sarah has always been a dreamer," James began, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "She sees the best in everyone, sometimes even when that best isn't very much." A few guests chuckled uncomfortably. "Today she's married a man who, well, let's just say he's going to have to work very hard to keep up with the Williams family standards." Michael felt his jaw clench as James continued. "We've always told Sarah that love is important, but so is security. So is being able to provide for your family. So is having the resources to weather life's storms." His eyes found Michael's across the room. "I just hope my new brother-in-law understands the magnitude of the responsibility he's taken on." The room was dead silent. Sarah's face was flushed with embarrassment and anger. Michael could feel 200 pairs of eyes on him, waiting to see how he would react to this public humiliation. Several guests were actually pulling out their phones to record what happened next. Michael stood up slowly, his hands steady despite the rage building inside him. For a moment, everyone thought he might fight back, might defend himself against James's insulting implications. Instead, He simply picked up his wine glass and raised it toward his new brother-in-law. "Thank you, James," he said quietly. "I appreciate your concern for your sister's future." Then he sat down without another word. The room buzzed with whispered conversations. Some guests looked sympathetic, others seemed satisfied that the presumptuous nobody had been put in his place. Sarah was mortified, but Michael squeezed her hand reassuringly. He would remember this moment, but not for the reasons they expected. As the evening progressed, the humiliation continued in smaller, crueler doses. When the band asked for requests, Patricia loudly suggested they play something modest since not everyone here can afford elaborate tastes. When the cake was cut, Robert made a joke about hoping Michael could at least afford to tip the catering staff. Each comment was designed to reinforce the same message. Michael Thompson was out of his league and everyone knew it. By the time the reception ended, Michael felt like he had been through a gauntlet. Sarah was devastated and kept apologizing for her family's behavior, but Michael assured her it was fine. They spent their wedding night at the resort, but instead of celebration, Sarah cried herself to sleep while Michael stared at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened. The next morning, as they prepared for their honeymoon, Michael made a decision that would change everything. He called his assistant at Meridian Capital Group. "Jennifer, it's Michael. I need you to pull the file on the Lincoln Park development project. The one seeking $840 million in funding approval. Of course, Mr. Thompson, is there something specific you need to review? Who's the primary developer on that project?" "Let me check. It's Williams Development Corporation. They've been waiting for final approval for 6 months. The project is scheduled to break ground next month if we sign off." Michael closed his eyes. Of course it was. The universe had a twisted sense of humor. "Jennifer, I need you to schedule an emergency review meeting for Tuesday morning. Full board attendance required. Should I tell them what it's regarding?" "Tell them we need to discuss potential red flags in the Lincoln Park project. And Jennifer? This is confidential until the meeting." What the Williams family didn't know was that their biggest development project, a massive mixed-use complex in Lincoln Park that would include luxury condominiums, retail spaces and office buildings, was entirely dependent on funding from Meridian Capital Group. They had already invested $12 million of their own money into preliminary work, architectural plans, and site preparation. The project represented the future of their company, with projected profits exceeding $100 million over 5 years. Robert Williams had been negotiating with Meridian for months, but all of his meetings had been with junior associates and project managers. The final approval had to come from the senior investment director, but Robert had never bothered to learn that person's name. He was just some bureaucrat who would rubber stamp a project that was obviously profitable. Michael spent his honeymoon in Tuscany thinking about what he had discovered. Sarah was so excited to finally be away from her family's criticism that she didn't notice her new husband's distraction. They toured vineyards, explored ancient cities, and enjoyed romantic dinners under the stars. But in quiet moments, Michael's mind kept returning to that conference room where he would soon hold his in-laws' future in his hands. When they returned to Chicago 2 weeks later, Michael threw himself into reviewing the Lincoln Park project. He examined every detail with the thoroughness that had made him legendary in the industry. The project was solid, financially sound, well-planned, and likely to be profitable. Under normal circumstances, he would have approved it without hesitation. But these weren't normal circumstances. On Tuesday morning, Michael walked into the Meridian Capital Group boardroom wearing his best suit, a custom-tailored charcoal gray piece that cost more than some people's monthly rent. His colleagues were already seated around the polished mahogany table, each holding a copy of the Lincoln Park project file. "Good morning, everyone," Michael began, taking his seat at the head of the table. "I've called this meeting to discuss some concerns I have about the Williams Development Corporation project." For the next hour, Michael presented a masterful analysis of potential risks. He highlighted Chicago's changing real estate market, raised questions about long-term demographic trends in the Lincoln Park area, and expressed concerns about the developer's ability to handle a project of this magnitude. Every point he made was technically valid, though individually none of them would normally be enough to kill an 8-100- and $40 million deal. But when the senior investment director at Meridian Capital Group expressed doubts, people listened. "I'm recommending we pass on this project," Michael concluded. "The risk-to-reward ratio isn't favorable given current market conditions." The room was silent for a moment. And Jennifer Morrison, the chief financial officer, spoke up. "Michael, I have to say, this seems unusually cautious for you. This project has been vetted by 3 different teams, and everyone agreed it was a strong investment." Michael met her gaze steadily. "Sometimes the numbers don't tell the whole story. I've learned to trust my instincts about developers, and something about this one concerns me." What he didn't say was that he had spent his wedding reception watching the developer's family reveal their true character, and he had serious doubts about doing business with people who would publicly humiliate a man for the crime of loving their daughter. The vote was unanimous. When the senior investment director recommended against a project, the board followed his lead. Meridian Capital Group would not be funding the Lincoln Park development. The news reached Williams Development Corporation that afternoon. Robert Williams received the call in his corner office, overlooking the Chicago River. The voice on the other end was professional but final. "After careful consideration, Meridian Capital Group has decided not to move forward with funding for the Lincoln Park project. We wish you success in finding alternative financing." Robert dropped the phone and stared out his window. $840 million had just vanished. Worse than that, word would spread quickly through Chicago's development community that Meridian had passed on a Williams project. Other investors would wonder what red flags they had seen. Alternative financing would be nearly impossible to secure. Patricia was in the middle of planning a charity luncheon when Robert called her with the news. "What do you mean they rejected us?" she demanded. "We've never been rejected for financing, never." James was reviewing architectural plans when his father broke the news. "This is impossible," he said. "We've already committed $12 million. We have contractors lined up, materials ordered, workers scheduled to start next month. How can they just pull out now?" The family held an emergency meeting that evening in Robert's home office. The mood was grim as they discussed their options. Without the Meridian funding, the Lincoln Park project was dead. They could survive the financial loss, but the damage to their reputation might be irreparable. "I want to know who made this decision," Robert said, pacing behind his desk. "I want to know who at Meridian killed our project, and I want to know why." It took 3 days and several phone calls to well-connected friends before Robert learned the truth. The decision had come from the senior investment director, a man named Michael Thompson. The name meant nothing to Robert at first, but when his secretary handed him the background information she had gathered, his face went white. Michael Thompson, age 32, Northwestern University graduate, 15 years with Meridian Capital Group. Senior Investment Director with final approval authority on infrastructure projects. Salary: $550,000 annually, plus bonuses. Net worth estimated at over $2 million. Michael Thompson, his daughter's husband. Robert sat in his office for an hour, staring at the information. The man he had dismissed as a nobody, the man his family had publicly humiliated, the man they had treated like he was unworthy of their daughter, that man controlled nearly $1 billion in funding decisions. That evening, Robert called an emergency family meeting. Patricia and James arrived expecting to discuss damage control strategies for the failed project. Instead, they found Robert holding a file folder and looking like he had seen a ghost. "I know who killed our project," he said without preamble. "It was Michael." "Michael who?" Patricia asked, confused. "Michael Thompson, Sarah's husband. Our son-in-law." The room fell silent. James was the first to speak. "That's impossible. Michael works for some small consulting firm. He drives a Honda, for God's sake. Michael Thompson is the senior investment director at Meridian Capital Group," Robert said, his voice hollow. "He has final approval authority on projects like ours. He's the man who decides whether $800 million deals live or die." Patricia sank into her chair. But he seemed so ordinary. His clothes, his car, his apartment, Apparently, he chooses to live modestly," Robert continued. but his net worth is over $2 million, and his annual salary is more than $500,000. The implications hit them all at once. They had spent 2 years treating a multimillionaire like he was a pauper. They had publicly humiliated a man who controlled more money than their entire family had ever seen. They had mocked someone who could destroy their business with a single phone call. And he had. James was the first to fully grasp what had happened. He killed our project on purpose, he said slowly. This was revenge for the wedding. Robert nodded grimly. We treated him like garbage in front of 200 people. We questioned his ability to provide for Sarah, his worthiness to be part of our family. And all the while he was sitting on the power to bankrupt us. Patricia began to cry. Not the delicate tears of a society woman, but the desperate sobs of someone who realizes they have made a catastrophic mistake. What have we done? Oh God, what have we done? The full scope of their situation became clear over the following days. Word of Meridian's rejection spread through Chicago's development community exactly as Robert had feared. Other potential investors began backing away from Williams Development Corporation projects. Contractors started demanding payment up front instead of accepting their usual terms. The company's credit rating was downgraded. Within 2 weeks, Williams Development Corporation was facing a liquidity crisis. They had to lay off 40% of their workforce and cancel 3 smaller projects. The family's personal wealth took a massive hit as they tried to keep the company afloat. Sarah knew something was wrong when her parents stopped taking her calls and James began canceling family dinners. When she finally confronted her father, the truth came out in a torrent of regret and desperation. Your husband destroyed us, Robert said, slumped in his office chair. The man we thought was a nobody is one of the most powerful people in Chicago's development industry. And we humiliated him at your wedding. Sarah was stunned. Michael works in investment consulting. Michael works for Meridian Capital Group. He's the senior investment director. He killed our Lincoln Park project, Sarah. $840 million. Gone, because we treated him like he was beneath us. That evening, Sarah confronted Michael in their apartment. He was cooking dinner, humming softly to himself, acting like nothing had happened. Did you kill my family's project? She asked without preamble. Michael stopped stirring the sauce and turned to face his wife. For a moment, he considered denying it, but Sarah deserved the truth. Yes, he said simply. Why didn't you tell me who you really were? Would it have mattered? Would you have loved me more if you knew I was wealthy? Sarah sat down at their small kitchen table. That's not the point, Michael. My family wouldn't have treated you the way they did if they had known. Exactly, Michael said, sitting across from her. They treated me badly because they thought I was poor. What does that tell you about their character? So you destroyed their business as revenge. Michael was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. I destroyed their business because I realized I couldn't trust them. Think about it, Sarah. If they would publicly humiliate someone they thought was vulnerable, what would they do to people who actually couldn't fight back? Would you want to do business with people like that? Sarah had no answer for that. She had watched her family's behavior at the wedding with horror, but she hadn't considered the broader implications of their cruelty. They're family, Michael. My family. And they're also people who think money determines human worth. They re people who would embarrass a man in front of 200 guests because they assumed he was poor. Do you really want me to reward that behavior by giving them nearly $1 billion? Over the following weeks, Sarah watched her family struggle with the consequences of their actions. The mighty Williams Development Corporation, which had seemed invincible just months earlier, was now fighting for survival. Her parents aged years in a matter of weeks. James developed stress-related health problems. But Cheryl also began to see her family more clearly. She noticed how they treated service workers, how they talked about people with less money, how they viewed the world through a lens of financial superiority. She realized that their treatment of Michael hadn't been an aberration, it was a reflection of their fundamental values. 3 months after the wedding, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She cut all financial ties with her family and moved with Michael to a larger apartment that they paid for with his income. She took a job at a non-profit organization helping low-income families find affordable housing, work that her parents would have considered beneath their daughter, but which gave her more satisfaction than anything she had ever done. The Williams family made several attempts to reconcile with Michael, hoping to salvage their business relationship. Robert wrote a formal letter of apology. Patricia called to invite them to dinner, promising that things would be different. James sent an expensive watch as a peace offering. Michael declined all of their overtures politely but firmly. The time for reconciliation had passed. Williams Development Corporation eventually recovered, but it took them 3 years and they never regained their former prominence in Chicago's development scene. They learned to be more careful about who they underestimated, but by then it was too late to undo the damage to their relationship with their daughter and son-in-law. Michael and Sarah's marriage grew stronger through the ordeal. She came to appreciate his quiet wisdom and his refusal to let money define his character. He admired her courage in choosing principles over family loyalty. They bought a house in a modest neighborhood and filled it with love instead of expensive furniture. 5 years later, Michael was promoted to managing director at Meridian Capital Group, a position that came with even more responsibility and a salary that approached 7 figures. He continued to live modestly, drive practical cars, and treat everyone with respect regardless of their financial status. Sarah often thought about the night of their wedding reception, when her family had tried to humiliate the man she loved. They had thought they were demonstrating their superiority over someone they viewed as insignificant. Instead, they had revealed their own moral bankruptcy to a man who held the power to judge them for it. The last time Sarah saw her father, he asked her if she thought Michael would ever forgive them. She considered the question carefully before answering. "I think Michael forgave you a long time ago," she said. "But forgiveness doesn't mean trust. And it doesn't mean consequences disappear." As she walked away from that conversation, Sarah reflected on the strange justice of what had happened. Her family had measured Michael's worth in dollars and found him wanting. In the end, it was their own worth that had been measured and found lacking, not in money, but in the things that actually mattered. Think about this story for a moment. How would you have reacted if you were in Michael's position? When someone judges you based on superficial things like your clothes or your car, does that reveal something important about their character? And if you had the power to show them the consequences of their cruelty, would you use it? Let me know in the comments below, because this story raises questions that go far beyond one family's business deal. It's about how we treat people when we think they can't hurt us, and what happens when we discover we were wrong about who really holds the power. If you enjoyed this story, hit that subscribe button and let me know what other stories of hidden power and unexpected justice you'd like to hear. Because in a world where appearances can be deceiving, the quiet person sitting next to you might just be the one who decides your fate.